Okay, thank you. I just want to introduce the Dean of Faculty here at Dartmouth College, Carol Folt.
It's an honor to have a chance to welcome you on behalf of Dartmouth College to this panel discussion today titled, Why Does America Have the Constitution of 1787? New Historical Perspectives. It's especially nice for a Dean of Faculty to get out of the administrative building, especially on a beautiful Friday, to come to a conference like this, and for me as a biologist not to have to go to my lab, but to get to come to this talk and listen to people talk about something that is very important in our both historically and very relevant to our current times. The panel is a part of a conference titled Founding Choices, American Economic Policy in the 1790s. And that conference is being co-sponsored by Dartmouth and also by the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's also a pleasure to welcome such a wonderful panel, a distinguished group of scholars, and all the participants in the conference coming to Hanover to discuss and debate rationales for the 1787 Constitutional Convention. Panel moderator Joseph Cullen from Dartmouth's History Department was telling me that he believes that this is actually the first time that a group of such stature has actually come together to discuss the Constitution since the bicentennial of the events that were surrounding the writing and ratifying of the Constitution. Wow. So we're very proud to have you here. The Constitutional Convention, of course, took place more than 200 years ago, but as 18th century U.S. Senator Henry Clay said, the Constitution of the United States was made not merely for the generation that then existed, but for posterity, unlimited, undefined, endless, perpetual posterity. I'd also say that's a great sentence that would lead into academic thinking. We look for those things. The motivations and the intentions of the authors remain, of course, the subject of much scholarly and public interest, because after all, the Constitution of the United States is, as historian Victor Ambrose called it, the single greatest governing document. The panel that you're here to listen to today will bring to bear new research that focuses on early American economy and how the economic uncertainty of the time, which sounds familiar, brought out issues that led to the creation of the Constitution. So before handing the podium over to Joe to lead the panel, I'd like to just take a moment more to thank a few people who were very instrumental in bringing this conference to take place. The conference is actually part of a series called the Dartmouth Leslie Conferences, and this was a result of a very generous endowment by the late Dr. Alan Leslie, who was a 1930 graduate of Dartmouth, and his wife, who's also deceased, Frances Hall Leslie. Alan Leslie received a medical degree from Columbia, and he was the chief of medicine at the VA hospital in LA from 1948 to 1966 when he retired. His wife, Frances, graduated from Tulane, but she had her own Dartmouth roots. Her grandfather was also a Dartmouth graduate I have it down as 1850, so I guess that can't quite be right, though. So I think that might be 1950. I'm not sure. Now I think about it, that probably was 1850. So the Leslies, though, were really quite active thinkers about what would create a really wonderful intellectual environment in the institution. And so when they endowed these conferences, they said that they wanted, it was one of many gifts they gave to Dartmouth, but they wanted to develop a forum for faculty to bring together colleagues from around the world to address issues that would have broad academic, social, cultural, and be very topically interesting and relevant. They also wanted to make sure that in doing this, they would have an opportunity for public interaction, and so we're having this wonderful public panel today. And also, they wanted to see these works become part of the literature, and so most of them result in wonderful books, and I know people here are all working on their papers for that. This year's organizer I'd like to thank, of course, is Professor Doug Irwin from the Economics Department. Doug is the holder of the Robert E. Maxwell Endowed Professorship. and he's an expert in the areas of U.S. trade policy, the World Trade Organization, political economy, globalization, among others. He's also currently working on a history of U.S. trade policy, so thank you, Doug, for doing this. Doug is joined today by history professor Joe CULLON, who specializes in early American history, American economic and environmental policy, and he has current projects focusing on New England's maritime history, among other things as well. So thank you, Joe. And finally, I'd like to thank the Rockefeller Center because they're hosting this for us and co-sponsoring this panel. Megan Stephen in my office, Judy Fothergill, and Karen Pelletier in the economics department for helping with the logistics in planning the event. When the Leslies gave their gift for the conferences, they felt that there was a pressing need for these sorts of opportunities to bring national and international scholars, as I said, on topics of real import and impact. So I think they'd be very proud of the conference today and the panel, and so I thank you all. Thanks.
Thanks. After this morning's sessions at the conferences, I realized I had to go back to my office and sort of rewrite my brief introduction to account for Alexander Hamilton's genius. It seems a requisite for speakers at our sessions. And so in the opening salvo of the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton informed his readers and invited them into a great national discussion to deliberate the new Constitution. He advised or warned his readers that the deliberation on the Constitution would by no means be decorous or genteel. He rather warned that they'd be characterized by a torrent of angry and malignant passions. And he also warned that the proceedings would be characterized less by a justness of opinions than by a loudness of the declamations and the bitterness of the invectives. And we now know better than ever before, because of the numerous documentary projects that have taught us so much about the ratification project over the last several decades, that Hamilton's predictions were spot on. What followed from the appearance of the first Federalist paper in October 27th, 1787, through the ratification of the Constitution by narrow margins in New York and Virginia in the summer of 1788, was loud, it was bitter, it was occasionally vicious, it was sometimes violent, and it was always seemingly deeply partisan, and ever more so even as the new nation formed. What Hamilton did not know in 1787 was that his prediction about the tone of the great national discussion of that year would be equally true with the historiography that the Constitution has spawned now more than 2 centuries later. The source of this historiographical battle probably can be laid at the doorstep of progressive historian Charles Beard and his 1913 book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, a book that even its sharpest critics have recognized or acknowledged to be one of the most provocative, albeit controversial and influential academic books ever written, actually. And so, prior to Beard's book, the commentary on the ratification and creation of the Constitution celebrated the founders more often as disinterested statesmen bent upon creating a document that embodied the sovereign will of the people and at the same time represented the interests of all Americans. Beard essentially started what would be a full frontal assault on this understanding with his economic interpretation, and argued that the founders sought to protect and advance their own immediate economic interests and the interests of others like them, who were holders of particular forms of speculative and liquid wealth. Beard's analysis has not always stood up to the test of time. It's under increasing scrutiny. Parts of it has been found to be inconsistent or contradictory or even sometimes wrong. Other historians have come and advised that equally important, if not more important, has been the realm of ideas and literary practices to the structural changes that were being undertaken at the time. Yet Beard and his ghost could not be banished from scholarship. Indeed, if you go to any book written on the American Constitution over the last several years, Beard is almost always in the index. Even those who most desperately want to escape Beard grapple with him, therefore lending him an influence that extends well beyond his time. Professor RAKOVE pointed out that the centennial of this book will soon be occurring. I offer this brief introduction of the battles that ensued by those who embraced Beard, who became known as realists or progressives and neo-progressives, and those who took exception to his analysis, who became known as idealists or Whig historians, not because I want to perpetuate stark and reductive identifications, but because I would like in some ways for this panel to attempt to transcend them. While each of the scholars here today have at one time or another identified themselves or have been labeled as a neo-progressive or neo-Whig historian, none of them truly conform to the typologies that so rigidly define those ideal categories. And they seem to me especially well positioned then to speak beyond the rigid boxes of constitutional scholarship, and also to offer glimpses of what a post-Beardian, not necessarily an anti-Beardian, historiography might look like. I know their work well enough to know and to hope that they will not always agree, but I imagine that their disagreements will be instructive. I just also hope that as moderator, that their disagreements are not as impassioned or full of invective as those that Hamilton encountered in 1787. And so it's with pleasure that I introduce the four discussants today. The first will be Pauline MAIER. She's the William Rand King Jr. Professor of American History at MIT. She's the author of several important books, many of which are still will continue to be read by undergraduates, including From Resistance to Revolution and American Scripture, The Making of the Declaration of Independence. She will be bringing to completion another book, this time on the ratification of the federal Constitution, thereby solidifying her place as possibly the only author you have to assign in an undergraduate survey in revolutionary historiography, and we all eagerly await that volume. Our second discussant will be Jack RAKOVE. He is the W.R. Coe Professor of History and American Studies and Professor of Political Science and by courtesy law at Stanford University, where he has taught since 1980. He's the author of 4 books, including Original Meanings, Politics, and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution, which received the 1997 Pulitzer Prize in History. His currently has 2 books forthcoming. The first is Revolutionaries, Inventing American Nation, which will appear under the imprint of Houghton Mifflin. And the second, The Annotated Constitution, will be published by Harvard University Press. Our third discussant will be Woody Holton, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Richmond. He is the author of 2 books, the first of which is entitled Forced Founders, Indian Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia. And this title was awarded the Merle Curdy Social History Award from the Association of American Historians. He is also author of a recent book on the U.S. Constitution, Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. And finally, and by no means last in any respects, is Max Edelman, who is a research fellow and university lecturer at Uppsala University in Sweden. He is the author of what I really think is a quiet classic entitled A Revolution in Favor of Government, Origins of the U.S. Constitution and the Making of the American State. This book, I think, has great influence. It's the one title that I looked at on my bookshelf, published in the last 25 years, that didn't have Charles Beard in his index, which is indicative of the genius behind this book. And he is also the author of several articles on taxation as well as on war, and he is at work on a larger study presently on war financing in early America. So with that, I will really just ask Pauline MAIER to take over.
This has been a wonderful conference, but I have to say, Joseph, you have raised the most terrifying idea of the day. Are we about to have a Beard centennial? I can't imagine. This is supposed to be on the reasons for the Constitution, new perspectives, and the perspective I'm going to talk about is so new that it isn't in print yet. It comes from my work on the ratification of the Constitution, which has not been finished. People say, do you have a deadline? And I tell them quite truthfully that I do. It's 2004. That's what it said in the contract. It just isn't done yet. This is, what I'm writing is essentially a narrative history of ratification, and the most strange thing is that there is no book that was simply dedicated to telling the story of the ratification of the Constitution from state to state. I realized quite early in the process, however, that I couldn't just begin on September 17th, 1787, when the Constitutional Convention adjourned. I had to have some background, and I dealt with the issue by writing a prelude, looking at the background of the convention or the development of the convention through Washington, who was elected by the Virginia Assembly as a delegate, said he wouldn't serve, was told he didn't have to resign from the delegation right away, and spent a good part of the late part of, well, actually mostly the beginning of 1787, writing to his friends, trying to decide what he should do. Now, his correspondence are a wonderful way of getting at the problems which led to the felt need for massive constitutional change. His correspondence included some of the usual suspects, I suppose. John Jay, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, a whole series of other one-time Continental Army officers, a few other odd characters like young James Madison, and they do give us one version of the series, they do make it quite clear that there were a series of problems that seemed to make constitutional change mandatory. Jay was very concerned about persistent state violations of the treaty with Britain with regard to loyalists. Shays' rebellion made Knox apoplectic. His account of it was so exaggerated that you have to wonder if the man had all of his marbles and who he was talking to. But clearly this caused tremendous fear that the republic was going to dissolve in popular anarchy, as so many earlier republics had done. Congress itself couldn't even meet. You needed the 9 states in order for it to do anything of any significance. Through much of the winter of 1786-87, while Shays' Rebellion was raging, there weren't even 9 states fully delegated in Congress. And then, of course, to do anything, they would have had to act with unanimity, and you can imagine what the chances of that were. However, I think without doubt there was one issue that overshone all of these. James Madison put it very succinctly: no money. Essentially, the Confederation had no money. It could not yet get a revenue stream from the sale of the lands it owned. The states were supposed to pay requisitions and didn't. I think the figure on the money received from state requisitions in the 6 months before the Federal Convention was under $700. What that meant in a practical sense was that the United States government could not service the national debt, and particularly the national debt that was owed to foreign nations. It defaulted on an interest payment to France. It had very little prospect of being able to meet a scheduled principal payment late in 1787. It was paying interest on the Dutch loan by more loans from the Dutch. This was not sustainable. To Washington, above all, what this meant was that the United States could not be what he dreamed of having it be: a respectable nation in the eyes of Europe. Over and over, that's what he mentions. We should be a respectable nation in the eyes of Europe. And as Max Edling said in his rightly praised book, good credit was a critical component of what is expected of any 18th century nation state. What nations did, essentially, what they needed to be able to do, was to borrow to raise armies in times of crisis. A respectable nation without credit was unthinkable. What this means is the single most important part of the Constitution was Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 1, which gave to Congress the power to raise taxes, raise and levy taxes, import duties, excises. Basically, it gave Congress wall-to-wall taxing power. The Constitution also specifies that import and excise taxes had to be uniform throughout the United States, but direct taxes were to be apportioned among the states in proportion to their population, counting all free people and 3/5 of all others, which was, of course, slaves. You might say, what is direct tax? And you're not the first to ask that. Rufus King asked it in the Constitutional Convention, and Madison recorded that nobody answered. It was fought through in the courts. Legal historians are still trying to answer the question, and they're at each other's throats, best I can tell. But some things we know for sure. Poll tax. The Constitution refers to poll taxes and other direct taxes. The question, what were the other direct taxes? And for sure they included, I think, real estate taxes. But why were these to be apportioned according to population? Well, I think one reason was that coming out of the struggle with Britain, the Americans had as a principle a notion that taxes and representation had to be connected together. Remember, no taxation without representation. In the debates in the convention, it's striking, and afterwards, how often people said, well, the principle of linking these seemed just. It had another less admirable attribute, and that is, as some members of the convention agreed, linking population, including the 3/5 provision, with taxation might be a way of reconciling Northerners to giving the South additional representation in Congress for its slave population. The argument, as I understand it, was, yes, they get more representation, but you know, they'll have to pay more taxes too. On the other hand, I have no evidence that that argument was ever actually used. What is curious, however, is that how little discussion there was on how the apportionment of taxes according to population would actually work out. And as I'll say a little later, that was in fact a problem. However, the more important issue here is that this taxing provision was, I would argue, at minimum one of the most important, and certainly arguably the most important issue in the ratification debates. When critics of the Constitution said, for example, that it was going to create a consolidated government, destroying the states, more often than not, they cited the taxation provision. No form of revenue was earmarked for the states. They assumed the national government would therefore have a monopoly on all revenue sources. And a government without a revenue source was certainly slated for oblivion. This, they understood, was, as the critics feared, they understood was exactly what the Federalists meant to happen. They had other evidence for this insidious desire of destroying the states. For example, federal court jurisdiction, but I don't want to get into this. I have only a few minutes. But more important, I think the issue, the questioning of federal taxing power, particularly with regard to direct taxes, was a rights issue. What the critics argued was that the federal Congress simply did not represent people fully enough to have the capacity to levy taxes in ways that would not be oppressive to the people. Again, we go back. This was, I would argue, the number one rights issue of the debates over the Constitution, and it's no taxation without adequate representation. What they argued, I mean, think about it. The first federal Congress was to have 65 members, the lower house, the House of Representatives. The lower house of the Massachusetts legislature had almost 400 members. There's no comparison of the level of representation there. And so the amendment that the critics proposed would have forced Congress to let the state legislatures have the first chance on raising any federal levy of state taxes. Now, this was possible because each state's portion of a general levy would have to be defined. Why not let the state legislatures, where the people were more fully represented, raise them? And if the legislatures didn't act, well, then the feds could come in, and they could have, in one version of this amendment, levy an additional 6% since the original requisition was due, and that should be sufficient coercion to get the state legislatures going. Of the 5 states, or let me do it one more, 5 states that ratified the Constitution previous to the new government going into effect, plus North Carolina, who recommended amendments without ratifying the convention, all of them proposed the direct tax amendment. Only 2 of those 6 states asked, by comparison, that formally requested that a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution. So I think if you're looking for rights, it was no taxation without representation, much more than a Bill of Rights, as the conventional literature would suggest. The Federalists had an answer to this. They said this provision wouldn't work. Requisitions never worked. And if a state legislature refused to pass to levy a federal direct tax, the population would not tolerate federal tax collectors. There'd be fighting in the streets, chaos, civil war. They said also, we're not going to use direct taxes. Tariffs will be sufficient almost always. We will only need these additional sources of revenue in times of crisis, above all war. And when war occurred, time would be of the essence. But the most important argument, the one that was repeated by all the major spokesmen for the Constitution, was to impair federal taxing power in any degree would undercut the credit of the new government, and above all, its credit with foreign lenders. As a result, in July 1788, when New York ratified while recommending amendments and also instructing the governor to send a circular letter out to the other states asking them to join in calling for a second convention to consider the amendments proposed by the states, Madison and Washington were in despair. The one amendment they feared, above all else, was the direct tax amendment. Washington said it was the only one he had any real problems with. Madison was so upset that essentially he proposed a whole series of amendments in the first federal Congress to parry the hope of a second convention and all possibility that the direct tax amendment would be passed. Of course, those amendments came through Congress in a gutted form. Congress in September 1789 proposed 12 amendments, of which 10 were passed. We remember them as the Bill of Rights, but as best I can tell, nobody called them that in the 18th century. Not even Jefferson announcing their ratification in 1792. He had a long phrase he used instead, and as I say in the book, he could have saved a lot of words by calling it a Bill of Rights, but he didn't. The Bill of Rights we have, as Akil Rita Marr has argued, is the product of Republicans in Congress during Reconstruction, and in addition, an army of judges and lawyers in the 20th century. What about the direct taxes these Federalists were so worried about? Well, their fight was unfortunate, since there was no, in retrospect, there was no real threat. The federal government never made direct taxes a major source of revenue. They did try to levy them 3 times. Once 1798 on, I think, slaves and land in the Adams administration during the war scare with France. It was so unpopular. Well, it helped to spark Freeze Rebellion. And helped get John Adams defeated in the election of 1800. There were also direct taxes during the War of 1812 and the Civil War, But as it happens in those occasions, they did ask the states to levy them, more or less like the amendment. I mean, not exactly like the proposed amendment. All right, I'm done. I'm really done. Why not? Why did this not work out? Well, because apportioned taxes, according to population, have an extremely unfortunate economic effect. In the 18th century, it's possible to argue that it made some sense because wealth was relatively equally distributed. Even at the time, there were those that said, well, no, it isn't really. And one wise observer said, if it is true now, it won't always be true. And, you know, by the Civil War, with so much industrial development, it was clear the states weren't equally wealthy. And to have a tax apportioned among the states according to population with no consideration for wealth had the unfortunate effect of forcing poorer states to levy taxes at a higher rate than wealthy states, and that would also levy most highly on landed states, not wealthy industrialized states. So what do we come out with? To draw a general conclusion out of this, I think I don't really have time, except, of course, it does become clear that the critics of the Constitution weren't entirely off base. And what I will argue in general is that they got most of what they wanted, even if they didn't get the amendments over time, possibly because they really had their fingers on the pulse of the country. Thank you.
I think I'm happy sitting here, and that way you can signal me more easily. Should I get into trouble? I think I'd like to start with just by briefly discussing the question posed to the panel. How is it that we come up with new perspectives on the Constitution? I mean, it's not wholly intuitive that we should be able to do so after 225 years, give or take. You think everything that needed to be said or was important to be said would have been said by now, and yet the fact is that constitutional scholarship continues to flourish, and it's not simply repetitive. So one simple explanation for that phenomenon, and something that Pauline is, my good friend on my right here is happily taking advantage of, is so much of the documentation from the period is now so readily available in 20-some volumes of the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution, which will soon be online at the Rotunda site at the University of Virginia, so it'll be searchable by anyone around the world. Anything and everything printed in the 18th century is available, in America is available online. So it's true that quantity matters, and that's been a great aid to research. And the more sources you can read, the more you can think afresh about what you find there. In my own case, insofar as I've done any original scholarship on the Constitution, I think I could trace that to at least two factors. One is that some time ago, a long time ago actually, I started to take seriously a question that most historians disdained, but that lawyers were starting to take seriously. And that question was, what did the Constitution originally mean? For historians, that's actually kind of a silly question because the whole presupposition there is meaning is somehow frozen into a document at some moment through some magic transubstantiation kind of process. So it wasn't the kind of question I think historians would necessarily ask, but the lawyers were asking it a lot, and they continue to ask it today. And I think I had either the good sense or the good luck or some combination to think this is really an interesting question. It would be curious to know what a historian's answer to that would be. And so that's how I acquired a modest measure after some years of work of literary fame and continue to have opportunities to write about what I like to call the sleeper clauses of the Constitution, like the Second Amendment or the impeachment clause or whatever. So that's so I think there is a sense in which the questions that other disciplines ask, in my case law, but of course one could say this about economics or economic history. One could say about political science. May give historians new insights into how to think about what happened in the 1780s. And then I think in my own case to that I'd add a second factor, which is I have a peculiar, to use a phrase Pauline used this morning, a peculiar obsession with the James Madison, the way in which historians do sometimes identify or just get engrossed with the careers of particular actors in the past. Madison is, as my friend and actually your NYU colleague Pasquale Pasquino likes to say. I think of him also as a constitutional engineer. It's a phrase that Pasquale likes to use, and I think it's very apt. But it's clear to me that Madison is an incredibly interesting political thinker and political theorist and political entrepreneur and constitutionalist. And trying to figure out why he did what he did or how he thought the way he did has been a real challenge to me intellectually. And by virtue of associating with lawyers and social scientists, I've actually come to be able to, I think more critically and I hope more originally about what made Madison an original thinker. And because Madison played such a central role in the politics of constitution making throughout this period, it's given me a kind of very helpful and I hope useful insight into how to think about the whole process of constitution making. So whether obsessive or not, I've certainly found it helpful and useful. So those are my introductory thoughts. What I'd like to do in the 8 or so minutes I have remaining, but who's counting? Joseph, in fact. Is to make kind of 3 or 4 points. It's really a kind of distilled version of what I try to teach my undergraduates when I lecture at greater length on the subject. I actually happen to be packing my whole undergraduate lectures and slideshows over here in my laptop, so I was tempted to get the whole apparatus out, but I'll spare you, although it would be helpful if I did. So here are, I think, three or four big points I try to make about the origins of the Constitution when I teach the subject at great length to some very bright Stanford undergraduates. One is it begins really with a set of, I don't want to say prosaic, but a set of fairly specific public policy problems of the 1780s, the kind that Pauline was referring to. Issues of public revenue, issues of the regulation of commerce, issues of the enforcement of the Treaty of Paris, issues of being able to control and dispose of the great resource of Western land that the national governments come into possession of. It's the inability of the Continental Congress, the unicameral body in which each state had one vote that had been the national government effectively since the mid-1770s. It's the inability, or one could say, to use the language of the time, the imbecility, a very commonly used phrase, the imbecility of the Continental Congress. Its inability to discharge these basic duties and responsibilities. That's what I call the first road to Philadelphia. Call it the Schuylkill Expressway, if you will. For those who know Philadelphia. So just a set of specific issues requiring action for which the existing framework of government seems to be inadequate. The second road, let's say we're coming in on the Paoli local, as I used to ride. I may run out of routes before I get to my fourth point, but in any case, a second point, and I think in a certain sense an extension of the first point is what I would call specifically the problem of, and this is a very Madisonian point, is specifically the problem of trying to run a federal system which is based upon the voluntary compliance of the states as member units with the requisitions, the resolutions, and the recommendations of the Continental Congress. That's to say, the way in which the federal system under the Articles of Confederation is supposed to work is Congress recommends or issues requisitions, and the states are supposed to implement. And it's the failure of the states to implement, whether it's a failure of will or a failure of capacity. We could argue about that, and in fact, that is one of the things historians argue a lot about. But the perceived failure or inability, the imbecility of the states, or the incapacity of the states contributing to the imbecility of Congress, that's the second big issue I try to stress. And why do I try to stress it? Because in my story of how the Federal Convention acquires the agenda that it acquired, Madison's analysis of why the system is fundamentally flawed plays a really critical, it provides a kind of critical link in my analysis. And the way in which Madison configures this literally on the eve of the convention, about 6 weeks before the convention is due to meet, is he sits down and he jots down his thoughts on what he calls the vices of the political system of the United States, and he comes to a key point to which he gives the title want of sanction to the laws and of coercion in the government of the Confederacy. And it basically means the Continental Congress has no ability to coerce the states or to kind of forcibly execute its decisions. And he then tries to explain what is this problem and why does it exist. And he starts with two historical explanations, why the framers of the articles, or he calls them the compilers of the articles, why they didn't anticipate this would be a problem back in the mid-1770s, and then he offers a further reflection on what we've learned since about, the system worked poorly when there was external danger. Now, in time of peace, we shouldn't be surprised that it's working even less well. And then he shifts into a kind of recognizably game theoretical, kind of political economy kind of mold. And he comes up with three additional arguments, saying states have different interests. so they're never going to have equal incentives to comply with what the national government does. Secondly, there are always going to be state politicians who are going to have incentives to kind of argue we shouldn't do what Congress wants us to do for their own personal interest. And then he says, even where states agree that we have a common interest, if one group in state A isn't sure state B is going to comply, there will be a net drag on the system. Maybe nobody will comply in the end. So from the second line of analysis, the problem of system of federalism based upon the voluntary compliance of the states, Madison comes up with the radical conclusion that any system of federalism based upon voluntary compliance is not going to work. What you need instead is a system of federalism or national government based on law, meaning the national government has to be able to enact, execute, and adjudicate its own laws without depending upon the authority of the states. And that gets me to my third big point. Once you've reached that conclusion, that you need a government of laws and not of recommendations, then you need a real government. That's to say, you need a fully articulated government with all the trappings that Americans expect to find in most governments. I will stipulate, Woody might disagree, but I'll stipulate that means a bicameral legislature, and then an independent executive and some kind of independent judiciary as well. And this is where my third big point comes into play. So where do those ideas about what those departments or what those branches should look like, where do those ideas originate? The third big point I would try to stress is to understand American constitutionalism in 1787, you have to understand American constitutionalism in 1776. Why? Because it was in 1776 that the Americans first began writing constitutions in conjunction with the break from Britain. And the kinds of constitutions they wrote then, which were in some ways more or less Republican, and I don't have time to explain what Republican means here, but it does embed a whole set of assumptions. It does begin, for example, with assumptions about legislative supremacy, about the capacity of the people to be sufficient monitors of the misconduct of government. It assumes that executive power should be weak. It makes the judges somewhat independent, but still marginal players in the overall constitutional regime. It's the criticisms, and we see this, of course, in Madison, but by no means solely in Madison. It's the criticisms of the state governments in the decade since 1776, which provides the most fertile source of data, of material for the framers in 1787 to rethink what's the proper structure of a Republican constitutional government going to be, what's it going to look like. And that leads me in turn to my fourth point. So what, I have 90 seconds here? Give or take? 45? So the...
Don't cough.
92.
So the fourth point is one of the critical developments taking place in state constitutionalism in the decade after 1776 is coming to the recognition that you want to think of a constitution as a special kind of law, as supreme fundamental law, not just a super statute, not just a transition device to get you out of a state, the dissolution of government, as Locke would call it, that had taken place in the mid-1770s. You really want to think of a constitution as supreme fundamental law. How do you do that? It's one of the problems that's really been worked out in Massachusetts, and then importantly enough, New Hampshire becomes really the second state in 1784 to follow this example, if memory serves me correctly, and we can ask Jerry Daniel in the back hopefully I'm not mangling the story too much here. So it's the idea that you need a constitution framed by a special convention, not a legislature, and then given some direct expression of popular sovereignty, some direct form of popular ratification. And that's what, in fact, and this is where Pauline's book will come in handy and prove so valuable to the rest of us. The story of how the Constitution got ratified is a critical dimension of this whole operation. I think it's really critical that its federal supporters insist that the Constitution has to be voted up and down in its entirety. You can recommend amendments, but you can't make approval conditional upon the subsequent adoption of amendments. It really simplifies the decision-making process and I think produces a clean and clear decision. But the most important point to remember, I think, about this in the fourth of my points, is just to think about what a marvelous, to use a John Adams word, epical, EPOCHAL kind of experience that this really was. To think that the American people, within a space of 14 months from when the convention convenes, to when Virginia and New York ratifies the 10th and 11th states. To think you'd have these intense deliberations in Philadelphia, followed by the better part of a year of this great public discussion, where a lot of crazy things are said, including some of the objections that Pauline's taking too seriously, coming from anti-federalists. A lot of zany things are said, but a lot of really sensible things are said as well. There was no example for this in the Western world, and it's really a fantastic experience. And if you understand how great an experience it was, then you can understand why we have new perspectives on the Constitution. Thank you.
Well, you had your chance, and you blew it. You blew it. That, in a nutshell, is what Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and George Washington and Ben Franklin were muttering under their collective breath as they rode to the Constitutional Convention in May of 1787. You blew it. They were saying to their fellow Americans, it was wonderful that 11 years ago we declared independence from Britain and took power away from the king and parliament and put it in the hands of the people. But now that turns out to be not so wonderful because we put too much power in the hands of the people. One of the phrases that was used at the Constitutional Convention by both Hamilton and Elbridge Gerry, who actually ended up opposing the Constitution as too radical a change, was an excess of democracy. And you will see other supporters of the Constitution using similar phrases. I'll tell you some of them. Democratical tyranny. That's the problem, said one champion of the Constitution. Republican frenzy. My favorite is democratic licentiousness. That's what's wrong. The people have too much power. And so I want to argue to you that there's a real extent to which all these other issues that Jack and Pauline and Max is going to mention are true too, that we need to have a national taxing authority so we can have a national army to go after the Indians primarily, and for all these other things. We need to have all that. We need a stronger national union, but Jack mentioned Madison's essay, unpublished at the time, on the vices of the political system. He listed a dozen of them, but more than half of that essay was devoted to one of them, and that was the injustice of the laws of the states. That is, independence was declared in 1776, not by a single nation, but by 13 separate nations, and those nations had been guilty of many things. You've heard about several of them, but the fundamental one was injustice. And so there was a connection in the minds of the framers between give the people too much power, give the rednecks, the farmers, too much power, and they will screw it up. And here's how they screwed it up. In 1787, the year the Constitution was written, the United States was suffering through a terrible recession, characterized by ballooning government debts at both the state and the federal level, falling real estate prices. Does any of this sound familiar? And most importantly, skittish investors. That is, people who had money but refused to invest it. And the framers of the Constitution believed that third problem, the fact that wealthy people wouldn't lend that money out, that was the fundamental problem. That was the reason for the recession. We've got to get the nation out of this recession, and we've got to make sure, to the extent possible, we don't fall into another one. And how do we get the nation out of the recession? We make it a less democratic place. And that is that there's a real sense in which the U.S. Constitution is a rebellion against the Declaration of Independence, an effort to put that democratic genie back in the bottle. And let me give you some specifics on that. Why was there a recession according to the Founding Fathers? Because when you give those rednecks, ordinary farmers, power, which all of the states did, all of those 13 state constitutions that preceded the federal Constitution that had been written starting in 1776, all of them, and I think we'd all agree on this panel, right, were much more democratic than the federal Constitution. And so ordinary farmers, 90% or more of Americans, ordinary farmers had much more power during that first decade from 1776 until 1787 than they would under the Constitution. And that's the reason, the fundamental, most important reason for writing the Constitution, to take some of that power away from ordinary people. It's like taking the cookie jar and putting it a few shelves higher so the kids can't get into it. Not, I don't agree with Charles Beard, I'm glad Joseph talked about him so much, not because they were greedy, the Founding Fathers. They weren't anti-democracy because they wanted money for themselves, but they believed, as the parents in this room believe, if you leave that cookie jar on the bottom shelf and your kids get in there, they're going to make themselves sick. And so taking certain powers away from ordinary Americans, take them out of the state legislatures and put it in the hands of a remote national government, you do it, but you do it for their own good. So what am I talking about in this particular? What are the two most important things that our government does in peacetime? I'd argue those two most important things are determine the money supply, which determines whether I, as a debtor to a credit card company and a mortgage company, gain, or whether my creditors gain. So determining how much money circulates in an economy is one of the most important things that a government does. The Constitution transferred that power from the states that were very democratic relatively to the national government, which was not. Who here has New Hampshire currency in their pocket? Actually, I give this talk sometimes in Virginia, and there's usually a Virginian. I have some Virginia currency, but that's from 1865, and we took care of that. The states are not allowed to print paper money. The reason for that was a feeling on the part of the Founding Fathers that when you let them do it, they screw it up. The states had also adopted other laws that were favorable to ordinary people, tax relief, something that Max will probably talk about, prominent among them. And the Founding Fathers' belief was that the result of all of this pro-farmer legislation, pro-debtor, pro-taxpayer legislation, was it's sort of good for the farmers in the short term, like my child enjoying eating all those cookies. It feels good in the short term, but bad in the long term. So that's the other big power that the Constitution took away from the states. That is, this, as Jack mentioned, the states had been in charge of collecting federal taxes up until the Constitution was adopted. Didn't do it well enough, at least in the minds of Madison and Hamilton and Washington and Franklin and the others. And so that power, of course, got transferred to the federal government, which now has the authority to tax you and me directly. So those two powers, determine the money supply and who raises the federal taxes, got transferred from relatively democratic state legislatures to a federal government. You could call this paternalism, but it's benevolent paternalism. That is, we're doing it, we're giving the people less power for their own good. Now, how many minutes do I have? 6. I'm going to use my remaining 6 minutes to ask whether they were right, the Founding Fathers, when they said ordinary people have too much power and we've got to take it away from them. When ordinary people ran the economy, they screwed it up. That is, basically, if I won't take the trouble to go to the blackboard and write democracy equals recession, but if I were to write that as the view of the Madisons and Hamiltons, then I would cross a line through it for the standpoint of other Americans who believed that was not the case, who believed that, yes, there was a terrible recession on the eve of the Constitution, something had to be done about it, but they didn't blame it on popular rule. They blamed it on elite rule. So they said, yes, there's a recession, but it's not because ordinary farmers with dirt under their fingernails have gotten into power. It's because elites have too much power. So let me at least expose you to that side of the argument, because we tend to assume that everything the Founding Fathers did was right. I have to say, I think these guys make a pretty good argument. So let me see if I can do that argument justice. Yes, they say there's a terrible recession. The Founding Fathers said one of the reasons for that recession is that people are printing up paper money. These people say, that's not the reason we have a recession. Why do we have a recession? Taxes. They believed that those 13 state governments had taxed the American economy into a recession. There's a wonderful irony in this because, as we all know, what's that 3-word phrase that describes one of the major motives for the American Revolution? Let me ask a student. What's that 3-word phrase? Yeah, people are mumbling it. You're right. excuse me, taxation without representation. So they rebelled against taxation without representation. And what's the first thing those representatives did once they had their own representatives? Levy taxes that were on average 3 or 4 times higher than people had ever paid as British colonists. And they did this without putting any money in circulation for people to pay those taxes with. I have a question. Who here remembers green stamps? I see some people who have gray hair like I do. Okay, now leave your hand up if you still have any of your green stamps. There's usually one person in a group this big. Is there not one? No, somebody still doesn't have some up in the attic. Let me explain to the students, there were these things, you don't have to know. They're very rare. Now, so here's my point. If I was to increase your federal taxes by 25%, that would make you unhappy, right? It would probably hurt the economy too, right? It might really intensify the recession. But I'm going to intensify that even more by saying, okay, you've got to pay this huge new federal tax bill in green stamps. We'd go to that one person, I didn't have my one today, you'd go to that one person in the room and say, Dolores, you got to sell me some green stamps. And she would say, I'd be happy to. But it's for a price, as Pauline says. My point is, these taxes, not all of them, but most of the taxes levied in the 1780s that were so oppressive, had to be paid in gold and silver coin. That was the real money in those days, sort of the opposite of now. But gold and silver coin was the real money, and nobody had any. And so the few people that had it could command their own price, and that means just to pay my taxes, I might have to give up all of my livestock. And by the way, if I wasn't willing to sell my livestock to pay my taxes, the sheriff was willing to do it for me. That is, if I couldn't or wouldn't pay my taxes, he would come take away my livestock and sell them, and that would pay my taxes. And that happened to thousands of Americans. And they made the case during this recession of the mid-1780s that followed the Revolutionary War that preceded the Constitution. They made the case, thank you, Jack. They made the case that this recession is not only bad for those individuals, but it's bad for the economy as a whole. And there are 4 parts of that argument. 2 practical things. If you take away my livestock, well, how am I going to run my plow? There's no oxen to run my plow. There's no horse for me to ride around my farm or to take my crops into town to sell. So people were having their, to use a later term, means of production taken away from them to pay their taxes. That's a much bigger cause of recession. I'm not discounting the other causes that the Founding Fathers were so focused on, the need to encourage investment by not relieving debtors and taxpayers. But look at these other causes of the recession. Taxing an economy into a recession, causing people to lose their livestock, for instance. Now, in those days, if I don't pay my taxes, eventually I'll go to jail, right? Same thing was true then, and it was also true of debts. If you didn't pay your debts, you could go to debtor's prison. It's horrible for the individual, but one of the things that strikes me reading the commentaries from the 1780s, petitions to the state legislatures, essays in the newspapers, is that people pointed out that when a guy goes to debtor's prison, he's not the only one who suffers. His family suffers, of course, but the whole economy suffers because he's not producing. That's how a legislature taxes an economy into a recession. And then 2 more that I just think are kind of intriguing in my 60 seconds are secondary effects. Taking away people's property, putting them in debtor's prison. What does that do to immigrants? People in places like Scotland or Ireland or Germany who are thinking, potential immigrants, who are thinking about coming to America. The Founding Fathers were worried that pro-debtor legislation discouraged money from being invested. Remember I said that? Well, the people I'm talking about now said, what about this legislation? Isn't it discouraging immigrants from coming over? And immigrants, a lot of people don't believe this anymore, but in those days they knew that immigrants were wealth. That made a country strong and wealthy and powerful if you could attract immigrants. And when you have that level of taxes and no money in circulation to pay them, you don't attract people. And then finally, the last one I'll mention is if you're taking away people's property, you're putting them in jail, you're discouraging immigrants, that's depressing. And you think of that as a modern term, but people use it a lot as a time. You are depressing. They also said discouraging. You're discouraging farmers. And a lot of intellectuals in this room, we all get writer's block. And we think, well, plumbers don't get to claim plumber's block. But actually, farmers can get farmer's block. They can get so depressed that they don't labor. And that's an argument that many people made in the newspapers in the 1780s. We've got to relieve taxes on farmers, get some money in circulation so that people can pay their taxes. And the phrase was, we will thereby be calling hope to their aid. So I want to argue maybe the Founding Fathers were wrong. Thanks.
This will be a tough act to follow, obviously, but I'll do my best. What did the founders want with the Constitution? For the last 100 years or so, I think it's fair to say that the most common answer that historians have offered to this question has been economic advantage. Economic advantage for themselves and for the class that they represented. Most historians see the creation of the Constitution as the outcome of a struggle between social groups over the future of democracy in America. According to this view, the elite, ably represented by the Founding Fathers, were pitted against farmers and so-called ordinary Americans. Their goal was to curb an excess of democracy that threatened private property by setting aside the sanctity of contract. The non-elite, in contrast, tried to use state governments to provide relief for hard-pressed farmers. Central to this struggle was the public debt that had been built up during the War of Independence. By means of heavy taxes, the elite tried to transfer wealth from ordinary taxpayers to rich investors in government bonds. But in order to succeed, the elite had to displace the state governments, which in the years following the Peace of Paris had been all too ready to follow the lead of their constituents in voting tax relief. What they had to do was to create a central government that could realize elite objectives even in the face of popular opposition. Now, the non-elite saw what was happening. They refused to give up the control over fiscal and financial policy and therefore refused to transfer power from the states to the central government. This mainstream interpretation of why the Constitution was drafted and adopted wouldn't have proved to be so long-lived if it didn't include a lot of truth. There's no question that public finance and economic policy were central to the founders, and there's no question that most Americans feared both taxes and debts. There's no question that a lot of people made money when public bonds appreciated due to Alexander Hamilton's restoration of public credit in the 1790s. And there's no question that public indebtedness of any kind means that money is being transferred from taxpayers to bondholders. But does the mainstream interpretation capture the primary rationale behind the adoption of the Constitution? Or, equally important, does it capture its long-term consequences? I don't think so. I think that in order to do this, we need to give primacy to the arguments of the Constitution supporters rather than its opponents, and I also think that we have to take what they said seriously. For good reason, historians have paid much attention to the ideas of James Madison when explaining the Constitution. No one was better prepared for or more active in the Constitutional Convention than Madison was. In the year leading up to the convention, he wrote 2 memoranda analyzing the political evils of the American Republic. And historians of the founding hardly ever fail to mention these 2 memoranda. But they sometimes do miss one of the most striking things about them, and that is that Madison prepared for the convention not by analyzing democracies or republics or even constitutions. He prepared by studying confederations. Madison's notes on the past and present confederations were not, in fact, concerned so much with domestic issues, such as excesses of democracy, as they were with international relations and relations between member states. He commented extensively on the failure of confederations to effectively stand up against foreign powers and to maintain peace between the member states. And when he turned to list the vices of the political system of the United States, only 4 out of 12 of the vices he identified had to do with state legislation or domestic issues. The rest dealt with international and interstate relations and with the relationships between Congress and the member states. In a major speech that he held in the Constitutional Convention, state legislation had been reduced to only 1 out of 8 reasons why the American Union was in desperate need of reform. And before the convention, Madison argued that Congress should be equipped with the power to veto state legislation, or else, he said, quote, the states will continue to invade the national jurisdiction, to violate treaties and the law of nations, and to harass each other with rival and spiteful measures dictated by mistaken views of interests, end of quotation. And I think it's significant here that he mentioned the national government's ability to correct state laws and majority aggressions on individuals only as what he called another happy effect of a central government veto. And this stress that Madison put on international and interstate relations as the Union's most pressing problems was not unique among the founders. In fact, he is remarkable compared to other Federalists because he's so consistently concerned with domestic issues alongside with those international issues and the issues of interstate relations within the Union. Yet this desire to provide Congress with the power to direct policy within the state that he was interested in was very controversial and went largely unfulfilled. If anyone reads the records of the great debate of a constitutional reform, he or she will be struck by the absence of any sustained discussions about the aims of the American Union. And considering the fact that the entire point of the reform was to create a more perfect union, this does seem a little strange at first, perhaps, but I don't think there's any deep mystery here. The fact was that there was quite a widespread consensus on the purposes of union, and this made a point about the aims of the union largely unnecessary. I would say that in terms of aims, the Constitution represents no radical break with the Articles of Confederation, and which is the Constitution that it replaced. And I think that Madison's claim, which he made in the Federalist, that if the new Constitution be examined with accuracy and candor, it will be found that the change which it proposes consists much less in the addition of new powers to the Union than in the invigoration of its original powers, that this seems an apt characterization of the Constitution. Looking at the proceedings of the convention, I think it bears out Madison's claim. The Virginia Plan, which opened and set the agenda for the Constitutional Convention, began with the resolution that the Articles of Confederation should be corrected so as to accomplish the objects proposed by their institution, namely common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare. Although the plan gave rise to a lot of opposition, both supporters and opponents could actually agree on the aims and purposes of the Union. And Edmund Randolph and Roger Sherman said pretty much the same thing. The task of the Union was to defend the United States against foreign powers, to secure internal peace, to conclude international agreements, and to regulate commerce. Now, as Madison correctly saw, the problem of the Union was not a disagreement over what it should do, but a failure to organize it so that it could actually do what it was supposed to do and to exercise the powers it had been granted. The Constitution overcame this problem by providing for a separate and self-sufficient central government acting on individuals rather than states. And this allowed for the effective exercise of power, although in a limited and demarcated domain. This central government was designed to maintain interstate peace and harmony and to manage American interests in the international arena. It was not primarily designed to regulate the everyday life of American citizens. And to some extent, I think this still shapes conceptions of American government. So you'll find that some Americans actually think that their society is characterized by minimal government, whereas as someone who is not an American never doubts the existence of a truly powerful American state. The need to create a central government with sufficient powers explains why the Federalists did not care for paper money and why they looked out for the interest of bondholders. Now, for almost a century, historians have repeated the accusation that the reform of the public debt that followed on the Constitution's adoption was principally a means to extort money from ordinary taxpayers in order to generate windfall profits for undeserving speculators. There's now a large and growing literature that questions both if the bondholders were really so undeserving and if their enrichment was really such a bad thing. The reform of the debt created a securities market that kick-started the American economy and set the nation on the course to become the richest power in the world. But money, of course, represents not only wealth but also power. For all the relief they might offer, printing paper money and defaulting on contractual obligations would seriously impair public credit. And credit, in turn, was a major resource in international relations because 18th century wars, just like modern wars, were financed from loans rather than taxes. Alexander Hamilton once spoke of the ability to borrow money as so immense a power in the affairs of war that a nation without credit would be in great danger of falling victim in the first war with a power possessing a vigorous and flourishing credit. A government that issued non-convertible paper money and refused to honor the claims of its creditors would simply not be able to borrow money. Such a government would be seriously restricted in its foreign policy choices. Now, some of Hamilton's critics saw the implications of debt reform quite clearly. Public credit gave governments the ability to pursue mad schemes of ambition, one of them said, and the means of purchasing mercenary soldiers, of shedding the blood of their neighbors, and of cutting so many more throats than they would otherwise be able to do. Mad or not, the Constitution's empowerment of the central government certainly allowed the United States to pursue ambitious schemes. Money raised from loans and taxes played an important part in the nation's expansion and rise to great power status in the 19th century. And James Madison took a leading part in this process also. As Secretary of State, he financed the Louisiana Purchase. As President, he financed the War of 1812 by doubling the national debt. His successors also made frequent use of government credit, so loans paid for the acquisition of territory from Spain following the Treaty of 1819. They paid for compensation for territory and claims when Texas was annexed to the Union. They paid for the Gadsden and the Alaska Purchase. Loans paid for the conquest of Mexico in 1846. It paid for the Civil War. It paid for the Spanish-American War. Loans also paid for the many wars of the 20th century that made the American Republic a world hegemon. And today, I would say, no less than in 1787, the power exerted by the United States on the international scene rests in no small part ultimately on the ability of the federal government to issue long-term interest-bearing government bonds. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just going to immediately open it up to questions, and so please just raise your hand and, yeah.
I was interested to hear the important role of democratic licentiousness in driving forward things. The implication is that what the Constitution achieved was a disenfranchisement of the people. I'll put that in quotation marks. So there must be a lot of, there must be a lot of evidence that in fact that was accomplished. However, that poses an interesting point because to ratify it, the people who were disenfranchised had to vote for it. So they must have been really stupid and deserving of it.
Do you know how
As
they
a
got
result of it.
ratified
Now,
for
that's
instance?
for starters.
Sorry,
But
okay.
But, well, that's a question. But the other thing is that there's a lot of loose ends in what you said, which drive an economist a little bit around the bend. And one of these is you say, well, taxes were raised. Okay, that means the revenue is going somewhere. And there's more money being printed. Okay, that's going somewhere. Where's it going? Well, that's the implication. We know where it's going. It's going to pay down the debt, which is really a responsive thing. And the other thing is you say, well, it has to be paid in specie. And therefore, that's doing damage. That's going to, if you're driving up the price of specie, you have to be driving down the price of other things, including the price of paper money. But we know the price of paper money doesn't fall in this period. So that's not really an explanation for what's going on. So I'll leave it at that. But they're just too many loose ends, I think, in this explanation of
Sure.
of an anti-demagogic
Okay.
reaction.
Most historians would agree with me that at most half of Americans favored the Constitution, and many of us think it was much less than that. That it was a lot of very dishonest things were done on both sides, but I think more and more successful dishonest things were done on the side of the Federalists, starting with the appropriation of the term Federalist. Madison had said, "I'm not a Federalist, I'm a nationalist." But then in the ratification debate, he, along with Madison and Jay, wrote a set of essays called the Federalist Papers. And they represented themselves as being Federalists, even though he himself had said he was the opposite of that. And so we don't need to go through all the iniquity that happened during the ratification debate, but there was plenty, again, on both sides. But let's just take New York as an example. 2/3 of New York delegates were elected to the state ratifying convention dedicated to opposing the Constitution. How did they get those delegates to change their minds? Well, one positive way, which was they promised them a Bill of Rights. So it's important to remember, if you love the Bill of Rights, which I think that's what most of us love most about the Constitution, it's not the sweeping clause or copyright. Some of us like the copyright, but it's freedom of speech and freedom of religion and supposedly a right not to be tortured, etc. Those are all in the Bill of Rights. And so they promised those New Yorkers, as they'd previously promised Massachusetts and Virginia, in order to get them to vote for it, a Bill of Rights. The other thing they did to get New York to support the Constitution was Manhattan threatened to secede from the state and join the Union on its own. I'm just making the point that the fact that that ratification was successful was not an indication that the thing had broad support. And I think the other historians will back me up in saying that.
Speak for yourself, Woody.
In saying that,
You're on your own.
so you said it was massive. You said the vast majority of Americans supported the Constitution.
No, I just mean.
That's all I'm saying.
No, not for.
So on that point, did the vast majority of
The vast
Americans
majority,
support
no.
the Constitution
The
when it
public
was
opinion's
ratified?
divided. But on the other hand, Woody, I mean, you would have a puzzle. A, the Constitution does get ratified, but B, if you then go on to the first federal elections with the House of Representatives being probably a better test of the mood of the body politic or at least as good a test. The extent to which the Federalists sweep and carry the House of Representatives
But isn't
seems to me to be a pretty good index of the legitimacy of what had happened in terms of ratification
But
overall.
doesn't that prove Madison's point that if we extend the sphere of government, if we enlarge congressional districts, the federal congressional districts were on average 10 times higher than state level districts. And that was one of the attractions of them for the supporters of the Constitution, is that you make them bigger, you make it harder for those rednecks to run and get elected and to influence elections. Madison was very explicit on this point. He used the phrase divide et impera, which of course means divide and conquer. If we divide the masses, then the elites can have much more power. And it was quite successful in the first few Congresses.
Except Madison's perception of the House of Representatives it wasn't going to look all that different in the end from the state legislatures. It still had the same parochial settlements and the same parochial attachments, and it would
This
not
is one of the
affect,
best evidences of what I'm saying, is that Madison himself switched sides on all the issues that I talked about. He initially wanted to give the bond speculators every dime. He was willing to tax those farmers so hard that they had to give up their livestock and so forth in order to enrich the bond speculators. But as you know, he switched sides on that issue. He opposed the Bill of Rights. He later said to the effect of, I was wrong, the people were right, we should have written a Bill of Rights, we'll now include a Bill of Rights. He said initially, federal government needs to be stronger. He later says, actually, the federal government's too strong, so he switched sides.
Well, if the Bill of Rights was so important, and I agree it was one of the most successful issues that,
Sure.
that in the debates, why is it that of the states that proposed amendments before the government went into effect, only Virginia asked for a Bill of Rights? All of the states asked for protections of rights, but I mean, a Bill of Rights as such was only requested by Virginia.
Well, you know Ken Bowling's wonderful article on that he sees the Bill of Rights as quote several people from the time, as the Civil Liberties Bill of Rights as a tub to the whale. That is, in order to prevent the more
he was
radical
trying to
changes like the
avoid,
ones, which I think that was consistent
But that
with
was
what
a
you
rights,
said.
it was a rights issue. What
Yeah.
isn't consistent is, from my description, people are asking for amendment which gives the state legislatures more power over levying taxes, and you have the state legislatures oppressing the people.
Yeah, it's a slightly different group.
No, wait a minute,
Oh,
wait a
wait,
minute.
either
Now,
the people
wait a
or
minute.
not the people.
No, no,
Wait,
I'm saying
wait 1 minute.
anti-federalists are not the
How
same as
many
these
of these
people that I'm talking about.
Democratic state
For instance, George Mason
legislatures
was an
passed
anti-federalist.
oppressive taxes?
What I'm saying is-
Massachusetts, yes. Massachusetts was
Oh,
off the
name a
charts.
state that didn't.
Connecticut?
Absolutely.
New York?
Absolutely.
No,
New York
no,
less so.
no.
New York is one that didn't. Connecticut, or let's go down. Let's start with New Hampshire, where we are right now. Look at the petitions. Have you seen the petitions from the New Hampshire towns to the state legislature? New Hampshire.
I think we'd like to
oppressive
take
taxes.
another question from the audience.
Massachusetts oppressive Sorry.
Thank you, Judy.
Are there other questions?
Other questions? Yeah.
I think maybe 3 states didn't. have
This
oppressive
is about 15 degrees off plumb with respect to the topic, but I have you all down there, and I just cannot avoid asking you a more contemporary question of basically, I think, June of 2008, having to do with new interpretations of the Constitution. Justice Stevens and Justice Scalia cannot both be right about the interpretations of the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment. I know that Professor RAKOVE has already spoken out publicly on his understanding of Heller versus the District of Columbia. But I would really be interested in your reactions to the opinions of Justice Scalia and Justice Stevens from your perspectives on the understandings that motivated the Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights.
You mean mine or you mean the panel's? Theirs, okay. Since you know mine.
Oh,
okay.
by the way, and
I think Pauline
setting-
signed my brief.
setting-
his brief, I'm.
So you want Max and Woody?
set aside the fact that you're right plumb at the border between 2 of the states with the fewest laws having to do with gun possessions and gun carrying of all the 50 states.
Well, I'm sorry, but Swedish news media do not really report on what you're doing here, so I haven't got much of an opinion. From my work on the ratification debate, it seemed to me that much of the discussion about guns had to do with the militia. That would have been my view, but I also think that in the 10th Amendment, you certainly have the right for private ownership of guns, I would say, but I'm certainly not an expert on this. So.
Woody, do you, well, actually, let me offer one important response that's in the context of our discussion. If in fact you want to compare the two, there's something I've written about and intend to write some more about. If in fact you do compare the 2 opinions as discussion, that's to say Scalia's opinion for the majority and Justice Stevens' dissent, if you compare them in terms of how they deal with the historical evidence of, from the period, the striking difference between them is Justice Scalia is advocate and apostle for what's called the public meaning or semantic version of originalism. And the basic thrust of that argument is whatever was said in debate, the legislative history of the amendment is essentially irrelevant to interpretation. So it's what would an ordinary, detached, somewhat informed reader, who, when you think about it, can only be the creation of a modern intelligence imposed on the 18th century. If it's not somebody who really lived in the 18th century, whose words you can look at, then there's no other, epistemologically, there's no other alternative. It has to be a projection of the judicial personality onto the past. But anyway, Justice Scalia's position as a quote-unquote originalist, and I put that in quotes, is that it's not about what was being debated, it's about this imaginary reader. I actually have a name for this guy, Joe the Plowman. Is my title. Whereas Justice Stevens, in his dissent, although I think there are some gaps in the historical record, to be sure, that Justice Stevens relies on, but nevertheless, Justice Stevens does attempt to figure out what were they actually talking about. Why did the Second Amendment make its way into the Constitution? And that, anybody who wants to think critically about this issue, it seems to me that's one of the first things you really have to know.
Let's see if there's another question out there.
Or if not.
Does anyone
You
want to
have
have a last word?
3 minutes left to finish up.
All right, well, yes, one last question.
The civilian.
you are all imbued with the mood of the country in 1787. Today, part of the discussion should be what the man in the rear said. What about originalism? When you were looking at the Constitution being written, how do you think they would have felt about it being totally unchanged over the next 250 years?
Yeah, I think that's a great, oh, sorry, did you want?
No,
Go ahead.
no,
Paul.
yeah.
I think it's a great issue, and that's why I think it's so important to look at their motives and see how different their motives are, what they loved about the Constitution and how different it is from what we love about the Constitution. I mean, if we asked around here, people would say things like freedom from unlawful search and seizure and freedom of religion and so forth, right? But do you know what clause was the most popular at the time? That is, that got the most sort of plaudits from the champions of the Constitution? It was Article 1, Section 10, which is the one that prohibits paper money. It's the contracts clause that prohibits the states from making anything except gold and silver coin a legal tender to discharge of debts. And two guys, just to take one state, Pennsylvania, two guys, James Wilson, later on the Supreme Court, Benjamin Russ, Asana, Declaration of Independence, both said if the Constitution consisted of one clause, and if that one clause was Article 1, Section 10, banning paper money and enforcing contracts, that would be enough to recommend it to our adoption. And the governor of my state, Randolph, said this was the best clause in the Constitution. In North Carolina, several people said different versions of it. It's the best clause in the Constitution. So it's hard for me to talk about originalism because what we love about the Constitution is so different from what the supporters at the time loved about it.
But what the man asked is, what did they think the Constitution should remain unchanged through time? Absolutely not. Their experience of constitutions was of their being adapted to changing circumstances. The federal Constitution grew out of a period of experimentation on the state level. New Hampshire was on its second Constitution already by 1787. And they expected that to continue. There was no guarantee that the federal Constitution to last as long as it's lasted. People would have been amazed. More interesting, I think, in the mid-1820s, John Adams, and both John Adams actually and Thomas Jefferson talked about the capacity of people to adapt the Constitution to changing circumstances. Adams made these wonderful speech. Actually, it wasn't a speech. It was a letter he wrote to a younger American saying, best I can tell, my generation was no better than yours. That you are educated and capable, and that we don't bind future generations, in other words, that you must use your intelligence to adapt this to changing circumstances, which is always very powerful to me when the question comes up with regard to the Second Amendment. I mean, the founders of the country, those who drafted the amendment, had no idea of the character of guns, which people have today, or of the urban circumstances. I mean, did they really mean that you could take an Uzi to Times Square? I mean, it is unthinkable. That they understood as circumstances changed, the law would have to be adapted. I don't think we need to chain ourselves to the understanding of the 18th century. No idea was more alien to the founders of this country.
In fairness to the people who support gun rights, they would say, okay, if you want to make it illegal to carry a gun in through Times Square, you've got to revise the Constitution. You've got to have a constitutional amendment. You can't just say new law for a new day.
Well, Jack's amendment, Jack's brief was extremely, we'll make Jack's amendment. Let's make Jack's amendment. It was very persuasive to me.
Better than
I
amending
think,
Jack, so.
Right.
More
You
possible.
can read the Second Amendment is quite ambiguous, I think, and can be read in different ways. And if you look at, I think, a lot of the contemporary relevance, the assumption was that private ownership of armaments was meant primarily for use within the militia. There's some evidence of private ownership, certainly for hunting and so on, but there was no notion that this was a universal right free of any regulation
That you
or
were about
limitation.
to constitutionally entrench.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
No.
have to stop.
Stop.
I want to just take this opportunity to thank the panelists because we are at time and I know we're on a quick schedule. So, thank you all.
Thank you.